Good evening, everyone. We have numbers of people coming into the Zoom room now. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds. We're up to about 45 people in there now, and we'll be started in a couple of seconds. All right, we're going to begin our presentation tonight, Birds, Whales, and Offshore Wind. Welcome, I'm Pat Gazemba, co-chair of Salem Alliance for the Environment, along with Jim Malloy, who came on as co-chair of Salem Alliance for the Environment in the end of October. And we welcome him. He is a breadth of environmental knowledge, and he is participating with many other groups besides SAFE. So thank you to Jim for joining us as co-chair. Tonight, we want to welcome more of you to participate with SAFE, and you'll see, we'll get up on the screen in a moment, the URLs that will help you to find SAFE on the internet. We have a very active Facebook page, and here you can see it, salemsafe.org. Salemsafe.org, by the way, is our website. We have a Facebook group, Salem Safe, and we have a Twitter account, Salem Safe. So we invite you to follow us in all of those venues. We post more immediate things on Facebook and Twitter and up on our website, rather than sending out messages to the whole listserv. But by the way, if you want to be on our listserv, and we hope you will be, we want you to send a message to salemsafe@gmail.com and ask to be put on our listserv, and we'll do that. We will welcome you right away. The other presentations that SAFE has done over the years are also archived on the Salem Safe YouTube channel. So you'll see that posted there, the YouTube channel. You can go there and see past presentations that we have done, and we will continue to keep that updated. I want to begin by turning the program over to Amber Hewitt and just tell a little bit about Salem Safe and our interest in offshore wind. It comes from a little newspaper ad that I happened to see, a calendar invite that was on in a Salem News article, and it had Amber Hewitt speaking at a library up here on the North Shore, and she was going to speak on offshore wind. And I was like, oh my God, we've been dreaming about that for Salem for so long, and here's somebody on the North Shore who's speaking about it. So we boldly, I guess I should say, I boldly called up Amber and asked her if she would come over to my house in June of 2018 and talk with a group of us gathered around our dining room table about offshore wind. And sure enough, she did. And that was the beginning of SAFE's going full steam ahead. I suppose we should say full breeze ahead with offshore wind. And so we've had a great relationship. Amber and I were just musing about how in June of this year, it will be 5 years that SAFE has been working with Amber Hewitt, following what she's been doing and getting a lot of good cheerleading and support from Amber. So it seems like Old Home Week to be welcoming Amber Hewitt to be the coordinator of tonight's presentation. So thank you very much, Amber, for guiding us.
Thank you so much, Pat. Thanks to SAFE, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in tonight. I really can't believe that we've been working together for 5 years now. I actually feel like it's been longer. I feel like we've been at this together just forever. It's been such a full, rich partnership ever since that first meeting. So I'm always grateful to be finding opportunities to work with SAFE. In particular, for those who don't know, I'm joining you from my home in Newburyport. So I'm also on the North Shore, and as we'll talk a little bit about throughout this presentation, it was a long time coming that there was offshore wind activity on this side of Cape Cod and further north. And for many years, we would gather in Salem and the surrounding area and talk about offshore wind, knowing that all of that activity was really taking place off of Somerset, New Bedford, and Fairhaven, and so to be able to and of course it's all coming into our grid and we're excited about it, but it's even better now to be talking about some activity closer to home. So I am the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director at the National Wildlife Federation, and I have been working at the organization for just about 10 years and on offshore wind for most of that time. So this was a cause that really drew me in very early in my career. And I, as many of you may be able to relate to, having grown up on the coast of Massachusetts, felt like I had been hearing about offshore wind for my whole life, but not really understanding why it hadn't happened yet in the US. At the time that I started working on offshore wind, there wasn't a single offshore wind turbine in US waters. And so when I was starting my career at the National Wildlife Federation and this offshore wind program was coming to be, I raised my hand enthusiastically to start to help build up this program, and it just kind of hooked me, and I haven't left yet. So 10 years later, here I am. And I am really looking forward to this conversation today so that we can just help talk a little bit more about the activity close to home and with our friends here from Maine today. So I will be facilitating the conversation, but I won't really be able to resist jumping into it here and there. Offshore wind and wildlife is really the intersection I spend all my time at. So I'll be mostly turning it over to our guest speakers, but I'll jump in here and there. So we're going to hear tonight from Eliza Donahue at Maine Audubon, as well as Kel Wilska at Maine Conservation Voters. And so before we dive into just questions and discussion, I'm going to turn it over to them for some brief introductory remarks, starting with Eliza. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amber, and thanks so much to SAFE. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the reminder that photo is just really outdated. I was so young and so innocent 5 years ago. Anyway, my name is Eliza Donahue. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Staff Attorney for Maine Audubon. Maine Audubon is an independent wildlife conservation NGO. We are based in Falmouth, Maine, that we have offices and sanctuaries across the state. And we are a wildlife and wildlife habitat conservation organization, like I said, and we use a variety of strategies to achieve that mission. Conservation, education, and advocacy, which is what I do, which has quite a bit of overlap with the rest of the work that Maine Audubon does. In my advocacy work, which is primarily at the state level, but also federal as well, because there's significant overlap, particularly in areas like offshore wind, I'm happy to be joined by a variety of biologists and ecologists that are the backbone of our advocacy work. We are science-based. We like to bring that perspective to the work that we do. And there's no better example of our work on offshore wind. You know, Maine Audubon's been working on offshore wind or has had a focus in this area probably for 3-5 years, something like that. And it's an extension of the work that we've done generally on renewable energy siting. Though we are a wildlife conservation organization, part and parcel to that is transitioning away from fossil fuels. And so work on energy is a big part of what I do, and particularly where that overlaps with potential impacts on wildlife and wildlife habitat. Lots of work on solar, lots of work on terrestrial wind, and today, and it feels like every day, because there's so much going on working on offshore wind. You know, like I said earlier, our focus is on state policy, understanding the levers in which state lawmakers, state decision makers can influence offshore wind. But again, there is a lot of action and a lot of important decisions. Probably some of the most important decisions happen at the federal level. And while that might feel sometimes far removed, it becomes close to home. And that we're really grateful that agencies like BOEM and others are really looking to actors in those states who are bringing particular knowledge or who are looking to contribute particular knowledge that can help them achieve the best outcomes for siting offshore wind and for otherwise helping the nation meet our renewable energy goals and our new-ish offshore wind goals. So that's a bit about me. I'm looking forward to this conversation this evening.
Excellent. Thanks, Eliza. Cal, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amber, and thank you, SAFE, for hosting us tonight. I'm delighted to be here and really looking forward to answering some questions about offshore wind in Maine and how we can apply this in places all over the country. My name is Kelt Wilska. I'm the Energy Justice Manager at Maine Conservation Voters. Maine Conservation Voters protects Maine's environment and our democracy by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. I just had to say our mission statement there. Always good to say. So as Energy Justice Manager at MCV, I work in 3 primary buckets: clean transportation, utility accountability, and offshore wind, and all with an eye towards equity and lifting up the voices of vulnerable communities, environmental justice populations, low-income communities, always making sure that they have a seat at the table and that their interests are front and center when we're pushing clean energy policy. So in the sphere of offshore wind, I like to think of MCV as a facilitator. You just heard from my amazing colleague Eliza, who is an expert on environmental and wildlife issues. And I like to think of MCV as a facilitator of a lot of different issue areas. So I, on behalf of MCV, serve as the Maine state lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. And I have the opportunity to work with a lot of different allies in this effort to make sure that we achieve responsible offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. And this is done at the regional level with my state colleagues working on various issues like transmission and environmental mitigation efforts, and also at the state level where I facilitate meetings of a smaller group that I call Mainers for Offshore Wind. And this is a coalition of Maine NGOs, labor allies that all work together towards this common goal. And so currently, we have been working on the comments for the state of Maine's offshore wind roadmap. We just submitted those. I'm looking forward to talking about that in a little bit, but the state has been working very, very hard for the past 18 months on a comprehensive plan for standing up a robust offshore wind industry in Maine. And we're delighted to be a part of that process and making sure that it is done in a responsible way. So thank you. And I look forward to answering questions today.
Great. Thanks, Kel. Thanks, Eliza. So as we dive into this conversation, ongoing invitation to everyone who is tuning in to please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout. We're going to have a bit of a conversation here for the next half hour or so, but I'll keep an eye on those Q&A as they come in, and we'll make sure to be incorporating those into the conversation. And then we have some time designated at the end of our hour together to really make sure that we bring our attention to those questions that you're sending in from the audience, especially if we don't cover something that you're asking for. We'll make sure to spend some time with your questions. So we are we're talking tonight mostly about the Gulf of Maine, of course, which is in close proximity to the Maine coast, but also the New Hampshire seacoast and the North Shore of Massachusetts. So the area that we're talking about is development area that would be it would be viable to send that power to any of our states. And then, of course, it's entering into the New England wide grid. So whether you're joining us from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, or Maine tonight, this is all relevant to the future of our collective and individual state energy markets. So before we really get into the wildlife issues, I just want to make sure that we set the stage for folks who haven't been necessarily following the play-by-play of where things stand on offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. So my first question is for you, Eliza. Can you, for those who really haven't been following the whole trajectory closely, just provide an overview of where the federal leasing process stands?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's challenge myself to be as brief as possible. So maybe it's an important kind of grounding fact is that the majority of offshore wind that will be developed in the US is going to happen in federal waters. And that's particularly so in the Gulf of Maine, and even more particularly so on the parts of the Gulf of Maine that are not adjacent, if that's the right word, to the state of Maine, because our governor has put a moratorium on any offshore wind in state waters. So I said earlier how the federal government, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, plays a huge role in deciding, is the kind of leasing entity for deciding where those developments take place. And it's a multi-step process. It begins with BOEM saying, hey, here's the big chunk of the Gulf of Maine that we're taking a look at. And we want to get input from as many folks as possible to start winnowing down that area. And we have gotten to a place where we are right now, where BOEM has released their call area, their draft call area. And that's, who knows how they got to that particular name, but that is the next step of winnowing down within this very, very, very large area, the areas that might be appropriate for offshore wind development. And it's good news so far, and we're not done doing that winnowing, because we will eventually get to the areas that are reasonably small, particularly in comparison to the entirety of the Gulf of Maine. But we're thus far, at least in Maine Audubon's estimation, BOEM's been pretty responsive. They've already eliminated eliminated the areas that are closest to the coast. They've pretty much eliminated 20 miles or closer to shore, with some very important exceptions. They've eliminated important ground fish closure areas. They've eliminated some coral protection areas, and that's great. And in the coming days, and I can't remember off the top of my head when they're happening in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, but I know it's in the next few days, BOEM is holding meetings where they're getting input from additional stakeholders to keep on taking that large area and making it smaller and smaller. So that's where we are right now.
Great, thank you. And I'll make sure to share the details for the Massachusetts meeting that you just referenced before we wrap up today, but it is in Salem on Tuesday, January 17th at 4 p.m. at Salem State. So I will reiterate that later, but so that folks know if they want to hear directly from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the officials that are doing the work that Eliza just outlined, they are coming to town just next week to provide a presentation and answer some questions. All right, so let's zoom into the state level now, and I'm going to turn it to Kelt, who, as Kelt shared, leads a group of Mainers for offshore wind and is deeply engaged at the state level as well as the federal level, honestly. But in parallel to the federal leasing process, there is a lot of work underway, as you alluded to, in the state of Maine to make sure that the state's ready to buy this power and to influence what offshore wind development will look like. So can you share a bit about what the state has done to date and what you anticipate in the year ahead, both administratively and legislatively?
Absolutely. So the Mills administration, Governor Mills, has set forth a very robust Maine climate action plan with phased greenhouse gas emission reductions, and offshore wind is going to be key in meeting those reduction targets. So the state of Maine, for the past 18 months, facilitated by the governor's energy office, has put together the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative and the roadmap process that I referenced earlier. So this roadmap it's a collaboration between the governor's energy office and the advisory committee, which is composed of many different stakeholder groups, from environmental NGOs to fisheries stakeholders to labor organizations, all working towards the common goal of standing up a robust offshore wind industry in Maine. And so they're all working towards that common goal. And sorry, let me just look at my notes here. Yeah, they're all working towards that common goal, towards responsible offshore wind development in Maine. And And we just submitted comments on that very recently. And we really praised those efforts. They have done a remarkable job, really taking into account many of the different stakeholder groups that are involved in this process. And so, like any comment letter, we gave a lot of compliments on certain areas such as environmental mitigation, the highlighting of an innovation hub in Maine that will really take advantage of the University of Maine's excellence in offshore wind technology development, and also workforce investment and supplier investment. Of course, as with any public comment letter, there is always room for improvement. And so we've submitted some comments on that as well. But so this offshore wind roadmap is really a really great start at standing up an offshore wind industry in Maine. And there is so much great work in there that I'm going to reference a little later about fisheries stakeholders and outreach to that community. And I could talk about this forever, but that's what's going on administratively, and we're ready and willing as advocates and as members of this coalition to support that process. And legislatively, I will say that we're working as a coalition on various strategies towards putting up legislation that supports that roadmap and pushes it even further. And looking forward to continue talking about that as we go on. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kel. And I'll just add a bit from the Massachusetts perspective in terms of state activity to be ready to harness this power from the Gulf of Maine. All of the work that Massachusetts has done over the past, well, since passing our first offshore wind bill in 2016, it's been updated a few times since then, but it set procurement targets for offshore wind that currently total 5,600 megawatts, so enough power for roughly 3 million homes. The Healy administration has already expressed a commitment to doubling that, so we will likely see the goal increase in the next couple of years. And that goal, whether it's doubled or not, could be inclusive of power that is developed in the Gulf of Maine. So when the state puts out its every other year request for proposals from offshore wind developers, once these areas are in the hands of developers after that federal leasing process plays out that Eliza described, the bids that come in to our request for proposals in Massachusetts will be likely some of them coming from the Gulf of Maine. So it's sort of an element too of how neighboring states can have a little bit of competition with one another as well, in that they may want to be a more appealing place to do business or set certain higher standards for labor or wildlife protection, all of the things we'll talk a little bit more about later. But since this power, as Eliza described, is going to be coming from federal waters, all of the states that want to go for it can get it. I'm not saying much about New Hampshire because they haven't made much of a play for this offshore wind power, have not been able to advance a procurement bill, but that certainly could come as well, and then they would be in the mix vying for that power once it's available. All right, so let's start talking a bit about wildlife concerns. We're going to set the stage with just the challenges that offshore wind development needs to consider. So as I mentioned earlier, being with National Wildlife Federation, we launched an offshore wind program 10 years ago. And it was really for two reasons. We saw, and it was started in the Northeast office, where we saw a really unmatched opportunity to advance a climate solution that we were not utilizing at all, right? There were already a couple thousand offshore wind turbines up and around the world, but none of them were in the US. And we have excellent wind and the right depth of water off of most of the Atlantic coast to harness this power, but we weren't doing it. And so at National Wildlife Federation, we were, incorporating this into our climate goals and starting to learn more about offshore wind. But of course, it's large scale infrastructure in the marine environment. And with that comes a lot of potential impact to wildlife and habitat. And so we also felt it was very important to stay at the table every step of the way and make sure that we're bringing our conditions to supporting this endeavor, right? Like we truly hope to see offshore wind successful, but our definition of successful includes protecting wildlife and habitat, providing benefits to communities, ensuring that there are fair labor standards. So this is, we come with a lot of asks, and I think it's just really important to underscore that when you're doing something this big, right, there's particularly since the Biden administration came in, and there's such a sense of enormous ambition, and so much of our national climate goals now are resting on being able to get offshore wind done. And when we're doing something that big, we need to make sure we're not repeating the mistakes of our past. And so we want to hopefully leave you all after this conversation feeling hopeful. I certainly I think we all share the optimism that this is possible, and just a real great attention to detail. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes the Gulf of Maine different, because there's been a lot of work along the past decade to consider wildlife impacts along most of the Atlantic coast, and some of those apply to the Gulf of Maine, but some of them do not. There's some unique challenges that are unique challenges to developing in the Gulf of Maine, where the water is deeper. There are some different wildlife, or just wildlife using the area differently than further down the Atlantic coast. And of course, some really significant fishing challenges, and a smaller energy market when you compare to places like off of the South Shore and off closer to Boston and New York. And so, may be tougher to make the case for really investing in this area. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Eliza, to just talk about some of the unique challenges that Maine Audubon has been most concerned with, and in particular, how is Audubon grappling with the potential impacts to birds?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And Amber kind of posed it as the unique challenges or concerns, but I'll start first with one thing that makes the Gulf of Maine unique, and isn't necessarily a concern for Maine Audubon, but is one that we're paying attention to. And that's the fact that the Gulf of Maine's really deep, and that means that we need to have floating turbines. We can't have fixed turbines. Cal talked about this as well. There's great research and development happening by the University of Maine and other places in the world, and we feel really confident that floating offshore wind, it can coexist with wildlife, and that there's a lot that we have learned about the fixed bottom turbines that are in Rhode Island, but more so the fixed bottom turbines that have been developed in the North Sea in Europe and other places in Europe. There's a lot that can be translated when thinking about what the impacts to wildlife are from fixed bottom to floating, which is what will be in the Gulf of Maine, but there are a few unknowns in there as well. So again, it's something that's unique. It's not a huge concern from Maine Audubon's perspective, but it is something different and something we're paying attention to. Unique concerns, particularly those related to birds that are on our mind, is, if I'm going to choose a couple, I'd say that the fact that the Gulf of Maine has a very high concentration of seabirds and some nationally significant seabird nesting areas on the islands off the coast of Maine. These places are really important. Seabirds, in order for them to rear their young to be successful throughout their life cycle, they spend a lot of time moving from their nesting areas out into the ocean to get food. And if there are turbines, there is a potential for turbines to displace those birds, to cause them to either take another route or move away altogether. There is the potential of other kind of more negative impacts. So seabirds are something that's really front and center for Maine Audubon when we're thinking about the potential impacts of floating offshore wind or offshore wind anywhere in the Gulf of Maine. I think the other unique challenge or concern is the fact that we don't know a lot about the Gulf of Maine in a way that's very different from the rest of the eastern seaboard. And what I mean by what we don't know a lot about it is there isn't great data on where wildlife are and where they move within the Gulf of Maine. That goes for birds, that goes for whales, for sea turtles, etc. And so a lot of this is a guessing game for us. We've got some good models out there and we can make very educated guesses. But that has been a really primary ask that Maine Audubon and so many of our partners have made to BOEM, to NOAA, to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is to really invest in gathering data so that BOEM and other state agencies can make really informed decisions when they're thinking about where they're going to put these lease areas where turbines will be located. So maybe just to recap, biggest unique challenges, seabirds and lack of data.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Kel, to talk a bit about fisheries. The intersection of offshore wind and fisheries has, of course, been a point of concern all along the Atlantic coast. And so can you talk about how this is playing out in Maine? What are the concerns, what's happening, and what needs to happen to best avoid and minimize impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to highlight a word that Eliza used just now, which is coexistence. And I think that our goal as advocates is to make sure that fisheries stakeholders can coexist with responsible offshore wind development. Obviously, fishing and fishery communities are part of Maine's identity. When you ask someone about Maine, often their first thought is lobster or fresh fish. So it's really not only part of Maine's identity from outside, but also it's deeply important to Maine communities within the state. Fishing really sustains many coastal communities, and we want to make sure that offshore wind only amplifies prosperity and doesn't take away from it. And so, like Eliza said, there are some things that we don't know about the Gulf of Maine and different impacts and how we can approach those impacts. But there are strategies that the state has taken through the roadmap that I mentioned to start doing just that, which is comprehensive environmental monitoring, reaching out to fisheries communities to make sure that their voices are at the table when we're talking about this kind of planning. I have right here some of the stipulations within the roadmap of collecting high quality, relevant data that's publicly available, proactively reducing conflicts, minimizing ecosystem impacts, and facilitating timely permitting, and enhancing regional collaboration. All of these different strategies will be key to making sure that fisheries and fishery communities coexist with responsible offshore wind development in Maine. And we really look forward as advocates to making sure supporting the state however we can with those efforts.
Thank you. Sorry, I got a little far from my mute button. All right, so I do want to circle back. I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A and have a follow-up question to Eliza, to something that you mentioned about the lack of data. And the question from one of our listeners is the lack of data on wildlife in the Gulf of Maine due to lack of studies or something unique to the Gulf of Maine? Just shed a little more light on that.
Due to lack of studies, at least as far as I know, definitely due to lack of studies. And I've yet to hear, though I haven't heard to the contrary, that there's anything kind of physically different about the Gulf of Maine that would prevent those studies. Perhaps the fact that it's really big. But yeah, there has not been a lot of investment in the studies.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit now about something that has popped up in the Q&A as well, which is the North Atlantic right whale. And this has been a primary focus and concern of ours at National Wildlife Federation ever since we started an offshore wind program. It was really the biggest challenge we faced at the beginning was uncertainty, not knowing what the impacts would be to any wildlife at that point in time when we were first diving in. But the one that we knew would certainly face significant risk is the North Atlantic right whale at the time, and now only the conditions have only worsened. It's a critically endangered whale, and just short of 350 of them are living today. And so there's really no room for error on a species that close to the brink of extinction. And this is a whale that migrates through all of the areas designated for offshore wind development, not only in the Gulf of Maine, but all along the Atlantic coast. And so the primary concerns that we faced to date when we're talking about areas outside of the Gulf of Maine with shallower water, where there's pile driving, fixed foundations, fixed to the sea floor, the risk of underwater noise is really significant, and the impact that persistent hammering can have has been an area of great focus. How to make sure to time pile driving seasonally in a way that does not align with right whale migration or avoids when they're most likely to be in an area. But of course, whales travel off schedule all the time. And so we also need to be able to adapt based on real-time observation, enforce exclusion zones and clearance of the area before, visible clearance, not any sort of active clearance, but confirmation that the area is clear before pile driving can occur, which means that pile driving can't start at night when you can't visibly ensure that there is enough of an exclusion zone without right whales in the area. There's also increased risk of vessel strike, because a large offshore wind construction project means that there are just far more boats in the area, many of them large installation vessels, but then there's also going to be crew traveling to and from the site every day for years. And so that increased vessel activity when vessel strikes are a leading cause of death for North Atlantic right whales is something that we take very seriously as well. And that requires another need for seasonal restriction on how fast vessels can go at certain times of year, a requirement for them to have species observers and ensure that they're doing their best to monitor for right whale activity as they transit to and from the site and around the project. Now, of course, when we talk about development in the Gulf of Maine, and these projects will be floating, that comes with an enormous, benefit in that there will be no pile driving. So it eliminates that, one of the greatest risks of offshore wind development to North Atlantic right whales. But it also comes now with greater uncertainty, because floating offshore wind is globally fairly new versus the abundance of data that we have from around the world for fixed foundation platforms. So now there are, we can eliminate some concerns, but then open up question marks about what these cables in the water column, what their impact will be on North Atlantic right whales. So there will also just be a real need to learn as we go. So we engage on this very closely. We have an abundance of best management practices and recommendations that we bring to the federal government based on the data that we gather about right whale activity, and how with climate change, right whale activity is changing even more in the past couple of years, and the way that they use areas off of New England are changing. And so we constantly feed that into our recommendations and ensure that we're providing government officials with the best available science and guidance from experts in the region. And we also bring that at the state level, because as we've talked a bit about, it's not, well, this is largely in federal jurisdiction. States also have a lot of power as the buyers of the energy to set certain standards that if we're going to buy this power, you need to meet our standards for all kinds of things. And that could include right whale protection. So this is something that we have a lot of levers that we can pull. It's getting harder when you talk about building so many projects in such a short amount of time and a critically endangered species. I certainly can't sugarcoat this. This is arguably the hardest part of my job. So all that to say, open invitation to anyone who wants to dive into the details, because we could have a whole night dedicated to right whales and offshore wind. So moving forward, I want to spend a little time talking about community impacts, and we're here to focus mostly on wildlife, but I do just want to touch on the coastal communities that will be impacted by offshore wind development, and to provide a fuller picture of the various considerations that go into how best to advance an offshore wind industry in the Gulf of Maine. So this is a question for both of you. I'll start with Eliza. Can you just share a bit about what offshore wind means for people in the place where you live, and what are the concerns that you hear most about, and where do you find enthusiasm?
Yes, so I'll talk generally, and I'll talk specifically, and maybe to about the place I live, because there are a variety of ways that offshore wind is received across different communities in Maine. I personally live in Brunswick, Maine, which is on the coast in closer to southern Maine, maybe about 20 minutes, half hour north of Portland for those who are not aware. And in my community, I hear a lot of enthusiasm for offshore wind. The two things that I hear the most are particularly those who kind of pay attention about renewable energy policy, or who are really committed to making change as far as mitigating for climate change, is they understand that offshore wind stands to play an enormous role in helping us achieve our climate goals. The other thing that I hear from my community is a lot of pride in the fact that the University of Maine is a real leader in research and development related to offshore wind. I think that that is something that makes offshore wind, which still is kind of an idea in many people's brain, much more, it grounds them in the possibility and creates a sense of pride, and also helps people make a much more direct connection between the jobs that could and that will result of a growing offshore wind industry in Maine. You know, the concerns that I hear, and again, this is more specific to my community, not just where I live, but the people who I'm surrounded with by professionally, and the constituency that Maine Audubon represents, and that's about impacts to birds. I know this question isn't supposed to be about wildlife, but I can't help myself. You know, we particularly hear about concerns about the impacts to migratory birds. People are aware that a significant amount of migratory activity happens in the Gulf of Maine. And what's great is that we get to deliver what's pretty good news, particularly when it's related to migratory birds. And that's the fact that the mean flight height, when birds are traveling from point A to point B, is much higher than most of these turbines, so they won't be impacted. Of course, that's not necessarily the case in inclement weather. But the other good news is that that often happens really close to shore. And that is, again, not where these offshore wind turbines are going to be. So it's kind of a concern that I like hearing, because we get to deliver the good news. And that good news that's always, of course, followed by, but here are 3, 5, 10, 20 things that we can also do to make sure that the impacts to wildlife and the environment are minimized, while at the same time really helping us achieve our clean energy goals.
Thanks, Eliza. Same question to you, Cal. What are you hearing? Concerns and enthusiasm in your community?
Yeah, I feel very lucky in my work to be surrounded by so many optimistic people who are just so excited about all the opportunities that can arise from offshore wind development in Maine. And I see it in 3 big ways. I see it, like Eliza said, with the university, and so many opportunities for education and continuing innovation, development of amazing floating offshore wind technology that will go towards putting real turbines in the water. I think of the benefits for people's electricity bills. The Russian invasion of Ukraine right now has caused natural gas prices to spike around the world. And Maine is particularly reliant on shipments of liquid natural gas, which is used to create electricity. And that's really caused people's electricity bills to go up. If we have offshore wind in the ocean, blowing all the time, we're going to have extremely reliable electricity throughout the winter. This is what we're struggling right now, is winter reliability issues, and offshore wind is going to be a huge solution to this problem in weaning us off of fossil fuels. And so third, I think about jobs and the opportunities not only for coastal communities to benefit from the manufacturing and assembly of offshore wind turbines, but also I want to highlight the inland communities that we have in Maine, whose could be mill towns whose mills have long ago closed and where there's a shortage of jobs. We can bring these communities into the offshore wind industry as well through various mechanisms, perhaps manufacturing or community benefit agreements that can be arranged with developers in different ways through either a request for proposals of the developers or on the via the federal leasing process. It's been done already, and I look forward to finding new ways to advocate for that on the federal level. But community benefit agreements are a really exciting way for offshore wind, the benefits of offshore wind to be shared equitably with different communities. And that can look very differently depending on whether it's coastal or inland. I know currently there are talks about a community in Maine for onshoring a transmission cable, and the community benefit agreement being worked out there involves maybe a public bike path or upgrades to the sewage system. There's so many ways that communities can be involved productively, collaboratively, and these benefits can be shared throughout the state in a really exciting way. And I'm looking forward to exploring new ways to do that.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we do have some great questions coming into the Q&A and our time is flying. So one last reminder to drop your questions into the Q&A as you have them, and we'll keep an eye there. So there is a question about, or a few questions actually, about any coordination with Canadian maritime wildlife advocacy groups or data that we're gathering, data that maybe is being gathered in Canada, and is that useful to us here? I'm going to turn that one over to you, Eliza, to see if you have anything to add there. I think this is largely well, at least on the offshore wind advancement front, Canada is a little further behind the US. They are starting to consider development off of Nova Scotia, but it's very early days. There's no leasing mechanism. I think things will probably accelerate. I mean, there's just a lot more hype around offshore wind than there was a few years ago, given the ambitions and scale, pace and scale of the Biden administration's ambitions. I think it's really sort of tipping some scales, but we're largely, I think, leading the way, and hopefully can have some new opportunities for partnership. But I want to turn it to you, Eliza, in case you have any sort of wildlife partnership or data that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I don't have any specific examples, though I might not be the right person to know exactly where we've gathered data data from in the kind of the royal we, where that data has come from. I can say I don't specifically have partners with in Canada with advocacy groups. However, I know that BOEM and others have cast a very wide net when doing that data collection. And certainly data from Canada, and Amber's obviously, right on point that Canada is not quite where the US is as far as offshore wind, but they very well could have great data on where XYZ seabird nesting is happening, migratory paths are happening. And so I have a lot of confidence that if that data is out there, it has been incorporated into the work that's being done by BOEM and NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera.
Thank you. All right, there's a great question about, and we'll talk a little bit more about advocacy. Always want to end on the note of building our collective to-do list, but there's a specific question about advocacy for research and how can constituents raise the volume for needing to gather more data. I think this may have been inspired by your comment, Eliza, on the just sort of the need for more studies. So I'll kick it off, just that they're asking for science is a huge part of what we all are doing here, in that as we provide comments to the federal government, a lot of our commentary is there's not enough information on this in this particular area or on this species, and we need more baseline data to inform our recommendations. And so that's an area where there's space for public commentary, and as well as at the state level, though. So these, data can be gathered and contributed by whether it's, state funded or federally funded. And so it's something to just, as there are opportunities to weigh in formally and informally, if you're meeting with your state representative, if you're meeting with your member of Congress, just make sure that they know that this should be a funding priority, that states should be if we're going to take on an endeavor like this, that both states and the federal government should be prioritizing learning as much as we can right now. So Eliza or Kel, do you want to add anything to that? Any particular venues in Maine or relevant to the Gulf of Maine?
I think you covered it, and maybe just to put a finer point on one thing, Massachusetts passed great legislation. You folks are aware of that. Maine, we're working on legislation in Maine, and part of both of those bills is calls for compensation or for money to be directed to a variety of different things that account for the impacts to wildlife in the environment, and that includes funding for research.
All right, I want to acknowledge, because I'm seeing several questions about the whales that have made headlines this week and washed up on beaches in New York and New Jersey in particular. And of course, this is just a terrible tragedy. It's the toughest news to read when we are all working so hard to protect marine life, and then they get stranded on the beach, and we don't know specifically why in each case. And there's been a lot of headlines, sort of pointing to, is this due to new offshore wind activity? And so I want to just say very carefully that we don't know. It's highly unlikely based on the activity that is happening offshore right now. It's pre-construction survey data gathering. These are slow vessels, and the activity that they're doing is quiet. They have trained species observers on board and should be reporting any sighting or interaction with whales. And so we are gathering information. We take this very seriously, to not speculate or point in any direction, right? Like I can say it's highly unlikely based on the activity and the data that we're gathering from the evaluation of the animals. But we just don't know. And this is why we have, the risk of vessel strikes to whales is so present offshore right now, with or without offshore wind development. And so we're learning, we'll look closely at what we learn from these whales, but it's certainly too soon to be pointing fingers at a specific cause, one particular vessel from one particular industry. These vessel strikes could be coming from anywhere. So very sad note, and we're tracking it closely, and we'll always take this very seriously as activity, offshore wind pre-construction and actual construction picks up offshore, to make sure that we're always informing and shaping and revising our recommendations as we need to. I want to talk a bit about just noting the time. I want to end on a note of advocacy and what folks can do who want to get involved, and why it's important to get involved. So I think there's a real element, and I'm so glad that we're gathered here today, of public education, right? We really need to be raising the volume of our requests right now, as our states and our federal government are moving quickly, and it's very important to raise the things that are important to us. I think if you are coming to this conversation concerned or skeptical, and I think particularly wildlife focused conversations tend to draw folks who are concerned or skeptical, and I hope that applies to some of you, right? It's okay to be not so sure how you feel about offshore wind, particularly at this phase, because we need to make sure that we're gathering all the input from everyone, regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of support, and using all of that to make this industry as responsible as it can be, and something that we can all collectively feel really good about. So I guess I'll start with Eliza. I'm trying to parse down watching the clock, but what's your advice to people who really want to dig into this topic, especially if they're concerned? Where do you direct folks who want to learn more and get involved?
Yeah, great question. And I've been distracted by some of the questions, and I just want to pull out one that I think is relevant to your question. it's a comment from Karen that it says, clean energy at scale will also have important positive benefit for migrating birds, also for the lobster industry. Could we talk about that? And that's spot on. That is the place that Maine Audubon's coming from. And I hope that, and I know National Wildlife Federation and MCV and SAFE as well, that that climate change is the single biggest impact and threat to wildlife in the environment right now. We need to be embracing offshore wind as a significant tool in that fight against climate change, that path towards clean energy. However, we need to kind of like hold that at all times, but then also do as Amber has suggested, be proactively, actively working towards making sure that everything that is done, or everything reasonably can be done to avoid and minimize those impacts. And I think the venues that are, at least we're prioritizing, and we think that there should be even more public participation are these upcoming meetings that BOEM's having, where these turbines are located, the wind energy leasing areas, is really important. And the public, BOEM's asking for people to come and give their input on areas to avoid, and they're listening. And I hope people will attend. I've heard now, tell me if I'm wrong, Amber, but the Massachusetts meeting is Tuesday in Salem. Maine is going to be on next Thursday in Portland. Forgotten when New Hampshire is, somebody will tell me, or will tell the group, I'm sure. But voicing your opinion, encouraging BOEM to avoid those areas, but then also showing your support, saying, hey, we're really excited you're doing this. And here are some of our hopes for those things will be located. And then also, though, again, while many of these decisions are happening at the federal level, there are significant actions that can happen at the state. And I think right now, a lot of state lawmakers are hearing about a lot more concerns about offshore wind and less about the enthusiasm for offshore wind. So I would encourage folks to reach out to their state lawmakers, share your enthusiasm first, and then have that be quickly followed by, here are some things that we think that you can do as a state lawmaker to minimize impacts to wildlife, to make offshore wind work for our coastal communities, for our inland communities, etc. So get in touch with those state reps.
Great, thank you. And I want to point to everyone to the chat that the details on the Salem meeting next Tuesday should all be visible to you there, 4 p.m. at Salem State. All right, Kel, I'm going to throw a challenge at you with 1 minute. Same question. How do you encourage folks to get engaged? But I want to just give you like a 30-second. There was a question in the chat specific to what are lobstermen worried about, and I'm wondering if you could just quickly hit the primary concerns from the lobstering community, and then wrap up with how you encourage folks to get involved.
Sure, I'm happy to. So lobstermen's concerns are very similar to those of ground fishermen's concerns, other types of fishing industries, and just that fishing grounds will be restricted due to the placement of the offshore wind farms. And so a lot of work has been done, is being done, needs to be done to make sure that those interests are heard, and to make sure that wind turbines are sited in different places than those fishing grounds. There are going to be impacts. We're not exactly sure what all of those impacts will be, but that's why monitoring and mitigation in advance is so important. And so there's a lot of great progress being done via the state and on these efforts. And I would say that, yeah, the restriction of fishing grounds is the critical concern, and being able to navigate around those turbines or even being excluded entirely. And a lot of work is being done to make sure that that is minimized. Regarding opportunities to get involved, Eliza mentioned the stakeholder meetings. This is an excellent opportunity within Maine. It's going to be in one place in Portland, but they're inviting folks from all over Maine. So I really want to encourage folks. wherever you are, come and share your unique perspective, because that's what they're looking for. Share your stories via discussions. It's going to be very interactive, walking around to different tables, asking questions, providing comments, physically marking areas on a map that you're concerned about or don't want to be impacted by offshore wind. That's a really great way to get involved. Also, like Eliza said, reach out to your legislators. If there's an opportunity with legislation to provide public testimony, that will be great. And also, you know, a lot of organizations like us are working on this. If you have a particular nonprofit that you're affiliated with or a member of that you know is doing great work on offshore wind, reach out to them, ask how you can plug into that effort. And there's often different ways that you can help out with your local organization. So those are my my little plugs there, and I hope that's helpful.
Excellent. Well done. Thank you. There are a lot of questions that we didn't get to tonight. So please, folks, you know, feel warm welcome to get in touch with us. You can reach out to our hosts at SAFE, and I'm sure they'd be happy to send you our way if you have specific questions that you'd like to dig into or follow up on anything that you've heard from any of us tonight. Thank you all so much. Thanks to SAFE for hosting us. I'm turning it over to Jim Malloy, so everyone stick around for a couple of wrap-up comments, but thank you all for having us.
Yes, won't even be a couple of minutes. I'll be fast. This was amazing. Amber, you rock. Every time I see you, it's like, oh, I wish she had gotten elected in Newburyport. So Amber, Eliza, and Kelt, thank you so much for starting this conversation. Obviously, it's the very beginning. You've been doing it for a long time, but for many people, it is the beginning, and SAFE wants to help out. We will have programming on offshore wind. We're very invested in the Salem Port marshalling area, and want to shout out to Joan Lovely, who is a great ally. She's our state senator, and she shows up for everything. Thank you, Joan, for showing up. And all the questions, if you have any, SAFE is willing to reach out to the experts and get a response to you. So send us by email. We will respond to you. And up on the screen, you can see that meeting next Tuesday in person in Salem at Salem State. We need turnout. And Eliza made the great point. Call your officials, not only state, but also federal. Call your elected federal senator and congressman. Tell them you want a solution to this crisis, and offshore wind seems reasonable to you. These people here, they're working on the problems. We are smart. As long as you're coming in good faith, you know, we welcome you. We just don't want obstructions. So thank you so much. Unbelievable program tonight. Amber, you are amazing. And Eliza and Kelt, thank you for your expertise. So that's it. Enjoy your evening, everyone.